It's December 16, 1944. Snow blankets the Belgian countryside as over 400,000 German soldiers prepare for what would become Hitler's final desperate gamble. But here's the twist. Leading one of the most elite divisions isn't some seasoned Prussian general with a fancy military academy education. It's a former baker's assistant who once fell off his horse during basic training. His name was Sepp Dietrich, and his story reveals just how ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary evil. Most people have never heard of Sepp Dietrich, yet he commanded some of Nazi Germany's most feared troops. He witnessed Hitler's rise from a beer hall rabble-rouser to the dictator of Europe. He fought on every major front of World War II, and his men committed some of the war's most shocking atrocities against Allied prisoners. So how did a simple Bavarian farm boy end up becoming one of Hitler's most trusted generals? The answer is darker than you might think. Born Josef Dietrich in May 1892 in a small Bavarian town, Sepp came from exactly the kind of family you'd expect to find in rural Germany. His father worked in the beer industry, not glamorous but steady work that kept food on the table. His mother was deeply religious like most Bavarians of the time. They had 6 kids total and Sepp was the oldest. Nothing about his childhood screamed future war criminal. He was just another kid in a working-class Catholic family trying to make ends meet. When the family moved to a new town, Sepp finished his basic education and immediately started working. First as a farmhand, then at 15 he got restless and decided to see the world. And by see the world, I mean he wandered across the Alps into Austria and Italy, then ended up washing dishes in a Swiss hotel. Not exactly the most promising start for someone who would eventually command tank armies. Here's where things get interesting, though. When Germany required military service, Sepp dutifully returned home in 1911. But his military career almost ended before it began. Within a month of joining the Royal Bavarian Army, he fell off his horse so badly that they discharged him for medical reasons. Can you imagine? The man who would later command Hitler's bodyguard couldn't even stay on a horse during peacetime training. He went back to his hometown and started baking bread. If the story ended there, Josef Dietrich would have lived and died as just another small-town baker. But then 1914 happened. When World War I erupted, suddenly every able-bodied man was needed. Sepp re-enlisted just days after Germany entered the conflict. This time, instead of cavalry, they put him in the artillery. And unlike his first disastrous military experience, he actually proved competent. He spent most of the war in the trenches of Belgium and northeastern France. He got wounded twice, once by shrapnel in his leg, but always returned to the front. By the war's end, he was serving in one of Germany's first tank units, which would prove incredibly important for his future career. But here's what's crucial to understand. When Germany surrendered in November 1918, the country didn't just lose a war, it completely fell apart. Revolution broke out everywhere. In Bavaria, communist rebels actually established their own short-lived Soviet republic. For young men like Sepp, who had spent years fighting for Germany, watching their homeland descend into chaos was devastating. He'd lost both his brothers in the war. The country he'd bled for was tearing itself apart. So when the new Republican government started forming paramilitary units called the Freikorps to restore order, Sepp jumped at the chance. The Freikorps were supposed to be temporary security forces. In reality, they became breeding grounds for extremist politics. Sepp spent months fighting Polish rebels in communist uprisings. He was angry, disillusioned, and looking for someone to blame for Germany's humiliation. Sound familiar? This is exactly the psychological profile that radical movements prey on. By the early 1920s, Sepp had settled down somewhat. He became a police officer in Munich and married a local woman named Barbara. They seemed headed for a normal middle-class life, but Bavaria's politics remained a powder keg and radical groups were holding rallies throughout the region. Now here's where the official Nazi story and reality start to diverge. According to party propaganda, Sepp was an early believer who joined Hitler's movement in the early 1920s and even participated in the famous beer hall putsch of 1923 when the Nazis tried to overthrow the Bavarian government. Complete nonsense. The truth is, Sepp was still working as a Munich police officer when the beer hall putsch happened. If he'd actually participated in an armed rebellion against the government, do you really think they would have let him keep his police job? Of course not. Sepp didn't actually join the Nazi Party until May 1928, 5 years after Hitler's failed coup attempt. By then, the Nazis had rebuilt themselves as a legitimate political party and were starting to gain traction. But they were still a fringe movement that most Germans ignored. So what finally drew Sepp to the Nazis? Simple. His boss at the gas station where he worked was a party member who kept talking about Hitler's message. In 1928, Sepp decided to check it out for himself. 5 days after joining the party, he also joined the SS, Hitler's personal protection unit. This wasn't the massive paramilitary organization it would later become. In 1928, the SS was basically just a small group of bodyguards whose main job was keeping Hitler safe during speeches. And this is where Sepp's lack of formal education and prestigious background actually worked in his favor. Hitler wasn't looking for intellectual elites or aristocratic officers. He wanted loyal, tough guys who would take a bullet for him without asking questions. Sepp fit that description perfectly. Within months, he was traveling with Hitler across Germany, standing just a few feet away as the future dictator delivered his fiery speeches to growing crowds. They developed a surprisingly informal relationship. Sepp was one of the few people who could speak casually to Hitler even after he became all-powerful. This personal connection would prove to be Sepp's golden ticket to power and influence. As the Nazi Party exploded in popularity during the Great Depression, Sepp rose with it. When the Nazis won over 100 seats in 1930, Sepp became a member of parliament. When they seized control of Germany in 1933, Sepp found himself commanding Hitler's expanded personal security force. But here's the thing about proximity to power. It comes with a price. In June 1934, Hitler decided he needed to eliminate potential rivals within his own movement. The SA stormtroopers had grown too powerful, and their leader Ernst Röhm was becoming a threat. What followed was called the Night of the Long Knives, a coordinated purge that would test Sepp's loyalty to Hitler in the most brutal way possible. Hitler personally handed Sepp a death list with 6 names on it. Some of these men were former comrades from the Freikorps days. Hitler's orders were simple: find them and kill them. Sepp later claimed he was troubled by the assignment, but he did it anyway. Over the next 3 days, his men hunted down and executed everyone on the list. They even killed the wrong person by mistake, a music critic who happened to have a similar name to one of their targets. When Sepp reported back to Hitler that the executions were complete, the future dictator promoted him on the spot. Some accounts suggest Hitler even told Sepp that he himself had briefly been on the purge list but was saved at the last minute. Whether that's true or not, the message was clear. Absolute loyalty to Hitler was the only thing keeping any of them alive. With the purges complete, Sepp's unit, now called the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, became Hitler's Praetorian Guard. They provided security for major Nazi events and were prominently featured in propaganda. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, when they held the Olympics in Berlin that same year, Sepp's men were always visible in their distinctive uniforms. But Sepp's personal life was falling apart. His marriage to Barbara was crumbling. partly because they couldn't have children, partly because he was constantly traveling, and partly because he was having affairs. He frequented high-end brothels in Berlin and had multiple relationships with other women. By the late 1930s, he was involved with a 22-year-old woman named Ursula, who was married to another SS officer. When she became pregnant with Sepp's child in 1939, it created a scandal even within the morally flexible Nazi hierarchy. Meanwhile, Hitler was preparing for war. When Germany invaded Austria in 1938, Sepp's bodyguard unit was deployed as a military force for the first time. When they conquered Czechoslovakia, the Leibstandarte was there. When they invaded Poland in September 1939 and started World War II, Sepp found himself commanding troops in actual combat. And right from the beginning, his men developed a reputation for brutality that went beyond normal warfare. During the Polish campaign, Sepp's troops were accused of murder and looting by their own German army commanders. When the campaign ended, there was serious consideration of court-martialing him. But with Hitler's protection, nothing came of it. The pattern was set. Sepp's loyalty to Hitler made him untouchable, even when his men committed clear war crimes. When Germany invaded France and the Low Countries in May 1940, Sepp's unit had been expanded into a full division. They spearheaded the attack through the Netherlands, captured Rotterdam and The Hague, then raced south to help surround British forces at Dunkirk. For these successes, Sepp received Germany's highest military decoration. But success came with a horrific cost. On May 28, 1940, near the French town of Wormhout, Sepp's men committed their first major massacre of the war. About 100 British soldiers had surrendered after being cut off from retreat. Following the Geneva Convention, they should have been taken prisoner and treated humanely. Instead, Sepp's troops herded them into a barn, threw grenades inside, then machine-gunned the survivors as they tried to escape. 81 Allied soldiers were murdered in cold blood. Sepp wasn't physically present during the massacre, but these were his men operating under his command. And this was just the beginning. After France fell, Hitler turned his attention to his ultimate prize, the Soviet Union. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941 with 3 million German troops, Sepp's division was part of the largest military campaign in human history. Initially, everything went according to plan. The Soviets were caught completely off guard and lost hundreds of thousands of men in the first few months. Sepp's division captured thousands of prisoners as they advanced deep into Ukraine. But unlike the quick victories in Western Europe, this campaign just kept going. And here's something interesting. Sepp was one of the few German commanders who publicly expressed doubts about the invasion. He told other officers he didn't think Germany could defeat the Soviet Union. The country was simply too big and the Red Army had too many soldiers. He was absolutely right, of course. But he followed orders anyway. As the campaign dragged on through 1941 and 1942, Sepp's division was shifted from front to front, Ukraine, the Crimean Peninsula, then back to France for rest and resupply. His men were exhausted, and many had contracted frostbite during the brutal Russian winter. By 1943, the tide had clearly turned. The Germans lost the massive tank battle at Kursk, effectively ending any hope of victory in the east. Meanwhile, the Western Allies had landed in Italy and were preparing to open a second front in Western Europe. Sepp bounced around from crisis to crisis. Italy when Mussolini's government collapsed, back to the Eastern Front as the Soviets pushed westward, then to France again when D-Day came. And here's where his military incompetence really showed. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Sepp was ordered to lead the counterattack that would drive them back into the sea. He left for the front without his radio equipment. Think about that for a moment. a tank division commander heading into one of the most crucial battles of the war without any way to communicate with headquarters or coordinate with other units. It's like a pilot taking off without instruments. Unsurprisingly, the counterattack failed miserably. The Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority in air support. Within weeks, German forces were in full retreat across France. By December 1944, Hitler was desperate. The Soviets were approaching Germany's eastern border, and the Western Allies were massing on the western frontier. So he decided to gamble everything on one last offensive through the Ardennes forest, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Sepp commanded the 6th Panzer Army during this offensive, and it was here that his men committed the atrocity that would define his legacy. On December 17, 1944, near the small Belgian town of Malmedy, Sepp's SS troops encountered a group of American soldiers who surrendered after their vehicles were destroyed. Under the rules of war, these prisoners should have been taken to a POW camp. Instead, the SS troops marched them to a crossroads and opened fire with machine guns. 84 American soldiers were murdered in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. Now, Sepp wasn't personally present at the crossroads when the shooting started. The immediate commanders were other SS officers. But as the overall commander of the 6th Panzer Army, the ultimate responsibility was his. These were his troops, operating under his authority in a campaign he was leading. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately failed. By January 1945, German forces were in retreat once again. Sepp was sent to Hungary for one final offensive to secure oil fields near Lake Balaton. When that failed too, he retreated toward Austria as the Third Reich collapsed around him. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30, 1945. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Sepp turned himself into American forces on May 9th, bringing his military career to an end. But his reckoning was just beginning. Unlike many German officers who were quietly released after the war, Sepp faced immediate prosecution for war crimes. The Malmedy Massacre had been extensively documented, with surviving American soldiers providing detailed testimony about what happened. In May 1946, Sepp and 73 other SS officers went on trial at Dachau. Ironically, the same concentration camp where the Nazis had imprisoned thousands of their victims. The trial lasted 9 weeks, and when it ended, 43 defendants were sentenced to death. Sepp wasn't among them. Instead, he received a life sentence. The judges recognized that while he hadn't personally pulled the trigger at Malmedy, his leadership and command responsibility made him culpable for his men's actions. But here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. As the Cold War heated up and West Germany became a crucial ally against the Soviet Union, pressure mounted to release imprisoned German officers. Many had military experience that NATO thought might be useful against the Soviets. Sepp's life sentence was reduced to 25 years, then he was released early in 1955 after serving just 10 years. The man whose troops had murdered dozens of American prisoners walked free after a decade behind bars. Justice wasn't finished with him, though. In 1957, German authorities put him on trial for his role in the Night of the Long Knives back in 1934. Remember those execution lists Hitler had personally handed him? German prosecutors finally decided to hold him accountable for following those orders. He was convicted and sent back to prison, but his health was failing. He was released again in 1959 and died of a heart attack in 1966 at age 73. Here's the most disturbing part of this whole story. When Sepp Dietrich died, an estimated 6,000 people attended his funeral. Many were former SS members who still saw him as a hero. They draped an Iron Cross flag over his coffin and sang old SS songs during the ceremony. This happened in 1966. 21 years after the war ended, in a Germany that was supposedly denazified and committed to democratic values. So what are we supposed to make of Sepp Dietrich? On one hand, he wasn't the architect of Nazi ideology or the Holocaust. He didn't plan the invasions or design the concentration camps. In many ways, he was just a loyal soldier following orders from his superiors. But that's exactly what makes his story so chilling. Sepp shows us how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. He wasn't born a monster. He was shaped into one by circumstance, loyalty, and a series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time. When he joined the Freikorps after World War I, he was just an angry veteran trying to restore order to his homeland. When he joined the Nazi Party in 1928, they were still a fringe political movement. When he became Hitler's bodyguard, he was just doing his job protecting a political leader. Each step seemed logical given his circumstances. But those small compromises and acts of loyalty eventually led him to command troops who murdered prisoners of war in cold blood. The scariest thing about Sepp Dietrich isn't that he was uniquely evil. It's that he was remarkably ordinary. He represents the millions of regular people who enabled the Nazi regime through their compliance, their careerism, and their willingness to look the other way when convenient. History wants us to believe that the Nazis were a small group of fanatical monsters who somehow took control of Germany. The reality is much more disturbing. They succeeded because millions of people like Sepp Dietrich made the practical decision to go along with them. Some did it for career advancement. Others did it out of genuine belief. Many did it simply because it was easier than resisting. But the end result was the same. A system that murdered millions of innocent people operated with the active participation of countless ordinary individuals. Sepp's story also reveals how post-war justice was often incomplete and unsatisfying. The man who commanded troops during multiple massacres served barely a decade in prison total. Many of his subordinates who actually pulled the triggers served even less time. By the 1950s, most were free and many had rejoined the German military. This wasn't unique to Germany. Similar patterns played out across Europe as former collaborators and war criminals were quietly rehabilitated in the name of Cold War politics. The desire to move on and build new alliances often took precedence over accountability for past crimes. What makes Sepp's case particularly galling is how he spent his post-war years rewriting his own history. He invented stories about his early military service, exaggerated his role in Nazi Party activities, and portrayed himself as just a simple soldier who got caught up in events beyond his control. The man who had personally carried out execution orders during the Night of the Long Knives wanted the world to see him as an apolitical military professional. It was a lie, but one that many people were willing to accept because it was more comfortable than confronting the full truth. Even today, some military historians try to separate Sepp's tactical abilities from his war crimes, arguing that he was actually quite competent as a tank commander despite his lack of formal training. They point to his unit's success in France, the Balkans, and the early stages of the Russian campaign. But this misses the point entirely. Technical competence doesn't excuse moral failure. The question isn't whether Sepp could effectively command a tank division. It's whether someone who repeatedly enabled and covered up war crimes deserved to hold command positions at all. The uncomfortable truth is that the Nazi military machine was filled with people like Sepp Dietrich. They weren't cartoonish villains twirling their mustaches. They were practical men who made practical decisions that happened to enable genocide and aggressive warfare. Some were true believers who bought into Nazi ideology completely. Others, like Sepp, seemed more motivated by personal loyalty and career advancement. But in the end, their motivations mattered less than their actions. When Sepp's men threw grenades into that barn at Wormhout, when they machine-gunned prisoners at Malmedy, when they executed political opponents during the Night of the Long Knives, The victims didn't care whether their killers were acting out of ideological fervor or simple obedience. Dead is dead. This brings us to perhaps the most important lesson from Sepp Dietrich's life: how quickly normal people can become complicit in atrocities when they're embedded in the right or wrong system. Sepp wasn't born evil. He became evil through a series of small compromises and acts of loyalty that seemed reasonable at each step. Join the party to advance your career. Follow orders to keep your position. Look the other way when your men cross ethical lines. Cover up inconvenient facts to protect yourself and your unit. Each individual decision was understandable given his circumstances. But collectively, they transformed a small-town baker into someone whose troops murdered dozens of prisoners of war. And perhaps most disturbing of all, when it was over, he never seemed to truly understand what he had done wrong. Even in prison, he portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances who had simply been following orders like any good soldier. This inability or unwillingness to confront the moral implications of his actions was itself a form of evil. It's one thing to make bad choices in the heat of the moment. It's another thing entirely to spend the rest of your life pretending those choices were justified. So when we ask whether Sepp Dietrich deserves to be remembered as one of the worst Nazi criminals, we're really asking a deeper question about complicity, responsibility, and the banality of evil. He may not have designed the Holocaust or planned the invasions, but he made those horrors possible through his willingness to be a loyal cog in a murderous machine. He commanded troops who committed documented war crimes, and he never held them accountable. In many ways, people like Sepp Dietrich are more dangerous than the obvious monsters because they show us how easily we might make similar choices under similar circumstances. They remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic speeches and theatrical gestures. Sometimes it just looks like a man doing his job. The next time you hear someone say they were just following orders, remember Sepp Dietrich. Remember that every atrocity in history required ordinary people to make extraordinary moral compromises. And remember that the choice to resist, even when it's difficult, even when it's costly, is always available. Because if we don't learn these lessons from history, we're doomed to repeat them. What do you think? Was Sepp Dietrich a true believer who deserved harsher punishment? Or was he just another ordinary person who got swept up in extraordinary circumstances? How do we balance accountability with understanding when it comes to historical figures like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this complex and troubling story. And if you found this deep dive into forgotten history valuable, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the people and events that shaped our world. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about understanding how human choices in the past connect to the challenges we face today. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget that our individual choices matter more than we might think. A man loses both parents by age 11, flees his homeland with nothing, and ends up wandering the streets of Munich eating from soup kitchens. Fast forward 2 decades and this same broken individual becomes one of history's most dangerous ideologues, helping shape the twisted worldview that would lead to the deaths of millions. Yet today barely anyone remembers his name. While everyone knows Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels, the man who literally wrote the book on Nazi racial theory remains hidden in the shadows of history. But here's the thing that should terrify us all. His ideas didn't die with him. They're still out there, still influencing people, still spreading hate. So buckle up, because today we're diving deep into the life of Alfred Rosenberg, the man who gave Nazism its intellectual foundation, and trust me, his story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about how evil ideologies take root. Let's start at the very beginning, because Alfred's origin story reads like a tragedy that was destined to create a monster. Born on a freezing January day in 1893 in what's now Tallinn, Estonia, Alfred Rosenberg entered a world that was already torn apart by ethnic conflict. Back then, the city was called Reval, and it sat right in the middle of a centuries-old battleground where Germans, Russians, and Estonians had been fighting for control. His father, Voldemar, was a successful businessman managing German company affairs in Estonia. Here's the irony that'll blow your mind. The man who would become Nazi Germany's chief racial theorist wasn't even really German himself. His ancestry was primarily Baltic, not Germanic. It's like the ultimate case of imposter syndrome turned deadly. But tragedy struck early and hard. Alfred's mother, Elfrida, died of tuberculosis just 2 months after giving birth to him. Imagine being a newborn and losing the one person who's supposed to protect and nurture you. Then when Alfred was just 11 years old, his father died too, leaving him completely orphaned. He was raised by his aunts, but the damage was already done. This kid had been abandoned by life itself, and something dark was growing inside him. The family was Lutheran Protestant, and young Alfred absolutely despised it. He later wrote about how kneeling during church services made him feel physically sick, saying it stirred up something inside him that could never be calmed. Think about that for a second. A child who's lost everything, forced to kneel before a God who seems to have abandoned him completely. Is it any wonder he'd grow up rejecting traditional religion and searching for something else to believe in? As Alfred grew up, he found himself caught in the middle of an ethnic powder keg. Estonia was part of something called the Pale of Settlement, where the Russian Empire forced Jewish people to live. The region was a melting pot of Germans, Russians, Estonians, and Jewish communities, all trying to coexist while tension simmered beneath the surface. Alfred was a decent student and even showed some artistic talent as a painter. Sound familiar? Just like Hitler, he had creative aspirations. But unlike the future dictator, Alfred never seriously considered making art his career. Instead, he headed off to study at the Polytechnical Institute in Riga. And here's where things get really dark. This is where his hatred of Jewish people first took root. Now here's what's absolutely chilling about this. There was no dramatic event, no personal betrayal, no specific incident that turned Alfred against Jewish people. He just absorbed the rising tide of anti-Semitism that was sweeping across Europe at the time. It was like a poison in the air, and Alfred breathed it in deeply. By the time he was a young man, he was already convinced that Jewish people were somehow responsible for all of society's problems. When World War I erupted in 1914, Alfred found himself in a unique position. He was studying in Riga when the city became a frontline battleground between German and Russian forces. The school had to evacuate to Moscow, so Alfred spent most of the war in the Russian capital, renting a small room and completing his architecture degree. And get this, for his final project, he designed a crematorium. Knowing what we know about his future role in the Holocaust, that choice seems almost prophetically sinister. During the war, Alfred met and married Hilda Liesmann, daughter of a wealthy businessman. But their happiness was short-lived. Hilda nearly died from tuberculosis in 1917, the same disease that had killed Alfred's mother. While she was recovering by the Black Sea, the Russian Revolution exploded across the country. When Alfred and Hilda returned north, they found themselves in the middle of a completely transformed world. The Bolsheviks had taken power and were ceding massive amounts of territory to Germany, including Alfred's homeland of Estonia. But German control didn't last long. When Germany lost the war, Estonia declared independence, and suddenly Alfred found himself a man without a country. Like tens of thousands of other ethnic Germans, he packed up his life and headed west to what remained of the German Empire. Alfred's first stop was Berlin, where he hoped to find work as an architect. But violence seemed to follow him everywhere. No sooner had he arrived than the city exploded into the Spartacist uprising, a communist revolution that sent Alfred fleeing south to Munich. His wife Hilda became ill again and went to Switzerland for treatment. Their marriage was falling apart, and by 1923 they were divorced. So picture this scene. Alfred Rosenberg, 26 years old, wandering the streets of Munich completely alone and penniless. He's lost his parents, his homeland, his wife, and his prospects. He's eating at soup kitchens and looking for any odd job he can find. Germany itself is tearing apart at the seams, ravaged by defeat, poverty, and political chaos. It's in this moment of absolute desperation that Alfred encounters the man who will change his life forever. One evening, probably feeling like he had nothing left to lose, Alfred attended a gathering led by Dietrich Eckart, a poet and journalist who was one of the founders of something called the German Workers' Party. This was the group that would eventually become the Nazi Party. Eckart took one look at this bitter, broken young man and saw potential. They began meeting regularly, bonding over their shared hatred of Jewish people and their belief that somehow Jewish conspirators were responsible for Germany's downfall. This is where Alfred's transformation from victim to perpetrator really began. He'd already been anti-Semitic, but now he found a community that not only validated his hatred but gave it purpose and direction. When a communist revolt broke out in Munich, Alfred became absolutely convinced that there was indeed a massive Jewish conspiracy to destroy European civilization. The pieces were all falling into place in his twisted mind. Through Eckart, Alfred became involved with something called the Aufbauvereinigung, or Economic Reconstruction Organization. On the surface, this sounded innocent enough, a group trying to rebuild economic ties between Germany and Eastern European countries. But in reality, it was a hotbed of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and ultra-nationalist ideology. They claimed to be promoting economic cooperation, but they were actually working to undermine the new Bolshevik government in Russia and spread their toxic ideas across the region. Alfred threw himself into this work with the passion of a true believer. Remember, this guy had lost everything to the chaos and violence that swept across Eastern Europe after World War I. In his mind, someone had to be blamed for all that suffering, and the Jewish people became his scapegoat. He wasn't just joining a political movement, he was finding a new religion, one that promised to explain all the pain and chaos of his life. By the early 1920s, Alfred had become deeply embedded in Munich's radical right-wing political scene. He joined both the Nazi Party and something called the Thule Society, a group that promoted the fantasy that Germany should return to some imaginary medieval golden age, when German knights supposedly conquered Eastern Europe. These weren't just political clubs. They were breeding grounds for the most extreme and dangerous ideas imaginable. Alfred quickly established himself as the movement's intellectual voice. He became editor of the Völkischer Beobachter, the official Nazi newspaper, and started pumping out a steady stream of articles and pamphlets filled with racial hatred and conspiracy theories. By 1923, he was one of the most senior figures in the Nazi movement, which brings us to one of the most important nights in modern history. November 8, 1923. Alfred stood alongside Hitler, Hermann Göring, and other Nazi leaders as they attempted to seize control of the Bavarian government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Their plan was simple: capture key government figures, take control of Munich, then march on Berlin and seize power across all of Germany. They were inspired by Mussolini's successful takeover of Italy the year before. But the putsch was an absolute disaster. When the Nazis marched through Munich's Odeonsplatz the next morning, government troops opened fire. 16 people died, dozens more were wounded, and the Nazi leadership was scattered to the winds. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The Nazi Party was banned. For most political movements, this would have been the end of the story. But Hitler had other plans. From his prison cell, he secretly instructed Alfred to keep the movement alive. Alfred established something called the Greater German People's Community as a front organization to continue Nazi activities while their leader was behind bars. For nearly a year, Alfred Rosenberg was effectively the leader of the Nazi movement. Think about that. During one of the most crucial periods in the party's early development, this broken, bitter man from Estonia was calling the shots. When Hitler was released in 1925, he decided to change tactics completely. No more violent coups. Instead, they would play the democratic game and try to build popular support through elections and propaganda. This is where Alfred really found his calling. While Hitler was the charismatic leader and Goebbels was the master propagandist, Alfred became the movement's chief intellectual, the man who gave Nazism its pseudo-scientific foundation. Throughout the 1920s, Alfred published book after book promoting his twisted racial theories. Titles like Immorality in the Talmud and The Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Jewish World Politics give you a pretty clear idea of where his mind was at. He wasn't just spreading hate. He was trying to dress it up in academic language to make it seem respectable and scholarly. Alfred also became heavily involved with something called the Nordic Society, founded in 1921. This organization spent decades promoting the idea that Germanic and Nordic peoples were the master race of Europe. They held cultural events, published books, and worked tirelessly to create connections between Germany and Scandinavian countries. In 1928, Alfred helped organize an Icelandic art exhibition that tried to link modern Germany with the Viking conquests of the medieval period. They were essentially promoting German cultural imperialism, preparing the ground for the physical conquest that would come later. But Alfred's masterpiece of hatred came in 1930 with the publication of The Myth of the 20th Century. This massive book was Alfred's attempt to create a complete racial worldview for the Nazi movement. According to his theory, there was once a perfect Aryan race that had migrated from the Asian steppes to conquer large parts of Europe and Asia. The Germanic and Nordic peoples were supposedly the purest descendants of these Aryans, while other groups had been corrupted through intermarriage with Semitic peoples. The book was absolutely insane. Alfred claimed that ancient Egyptians were actually Aryans because he liked the idea that his supposed master race had built the pyramids. He argued that Jesus was half Germanic, which made absolutely no historical sense. He even interpreted the French Wars of Religion as part of some grand effort to eliminate Aryan influence from French society. None of this was based on actual evidence or scholarship. It was pure fantasy designed to justify hatred and violence. But here's the terrifying part. The book became a bestseller. Alfred had tapped into something dark in the German psyche during a period of economic crisis and political chaos. His pseudo-intellectual approach gave people permission to embrace their worst impulses while feeling smart and sophisticated about it. He wasn't just spreading hate, he was making it fashionable. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for the Nazi movement. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed destroyed Germany's brief period of prosperity and stability. Suddenly, millions of Germans were unemployed, desperate, and looking for someone to blame. Alfred's books provided the intellectual framework for that blame, pointing the finger squarely at Jewish people and other minority groups. In a series of elections in 1930 and 1932, the Nazis went from being a regional curiosity to becoming the largest political party in Germany. They formed a coalition government with more traditional conservative parties, then immediately betrayed their partners and seized complete control. By 1933, Hitler was the undisputed leader of Germany, and Alfred Rosenberg found himself in a position to implement his twisted theories on a national scale. Alfred's first major appointment was as head of the Nazi Office of Foreign Affairs. This wasn't the traditional foreign ministry. Instead, it was responsible for building relationships with countries that the Nazis considered culturally similar to Germany. Alfred worked out of the luxurious Hotel Adlon in central Berlin, entertaining foreign dignitaries and traveling to other European capitals to spread Nazi ideology. The results were mixed at best. While Alfred did manage to build connections with some far-right groups like Norway's National Samling, many foreign diplomats found his constant lectures about race and blood to be bizarre and off-putting. His approach was too academic, too theoretical for practical diplomacy. But that didn't matter to Alfred. He was more interested in spreading his ideas than actually achieving diplomatic success. Much more successful was Alfred's role in what the Nazis called the Kirchenkampf, the war against the churches. Germany in the 1930s was an overwhelmingly Christian nation, but the Nazis viewed Christianity as competition for the loyalty of the German people. Many historians now describe Nazism itself as essentially a political religion, with Hitler as its messianic figure and racial purity as its core doctrine. Alfred threw himself into this religious war with the passion of a true believer. He targeted both the Roman Catholic Church and the various Protestant denominations, working to gradually undermine their influence over German society. In 1938, he gave a speech declaring that both the Catholic Church and the Confessional Church must disappear from the life of our people. This was the same man who had hated kneeling in church as a child, now trying to destroy Christianity itself. The conflict escalated throughout the decade. In 1934, the Vatican tried to place Alfred's Myth of the 20th Century on their list of prohibited books. 3 years later, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical called Mit brennender Sorge, with deep anxiety, that directly condemned Nazi attacks on the church and criticized the kind of neo-paganism that Alfred was promoting. The document was smuggled into Germany and distributed to Catholic churches across the country. In it, Hitler was referred to as a mad prophet, showing just how hostile the relationship had become. But Alfred wasn't just trying to destroy Christianity. He was actively promoting an alternative. Working closely with SS leader Heinrich Himmler, Alfred developed a bizarre neo-pagan belief system that mixed German folk traditions with Nazi ideology. He incorporated elements from a medieval French heretical sect called the Cathars, combined them with worship of Norse gods like Thor and Odin, and created what can only be described as a completely incoherent religious philosophy. The scary thing is, it worked. Millions of Germans began embracing these ideas, abandoning their traditional faiths for this new religion of race and nationalism. Alfred had successfully weaponized spirituality itself, turning people's natural desire for meaning and community into fuel for hatred and violence. In 1934, Alfred was given even more power when Hitler established something called Amt Rosenberg, the Rosenberg Office. This was essentially a government department with oversight of all cultural policy in Germany. From his offices near Berlin's Potsdamer Platz, Alfred could interfere in virtually every aspect of German cultural life. His office decided which books could be published, which art could be displayed, which ideas could be taught in schools. Under Alfred's direction, the works of great German writers like Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, and Erich Maria Remarque were banned and removed from libraries across the country. These weren't foreign authors. They were German citizens whose only crime was refusing to bow down to Nazi ideology. Meanwhile, Alfred promoted writers who championed German nationalism and racial superiority. The E.A. Rosenberg Office also established something called the National Socialist Cultural Community, which grew to include hundreds of chapters and tens of thousands of members across Germany. It was essentially a militant book club designed to spread Nazi ideology through cultural activities. They organized reading groups, art exhibitions, and educational programs, all designed to indoctrinate ordinary Germans with Alfred's racial theories. Alfred's influence extended into sports and recreation through his involvement with the Strength Through Joy movement, which provided recreational activities for German workers. Even leisure time wasn't safe from his ideological meddling. Every aspect of German cultural life was being systematically poisoned with his ideas about racial superiority and ethnic hatred. In 1937, Alfred received what was probably the highest honor of his career. Hitler created a new award called the German National Prize for Art and Science as an alternative to the Nobel Prize, which the Nazis had rejected after it was awarded to a German pacifist journalist who had exposed their illegal rearmament program. Alfred was one of the first 5 recipients honored specifically for his work promoting Nazi racial theories. The prize came with 100,000 Reichsmarks, making him a very wealthy man. At the awards ceremony, Joseph Goebbels, who was actually one of Alfred's biggest rivals within the Nazi hierarchy, was forced to read a citation praising Alfred's work. The irony wasn't lost on Alfred, who took great pleasure in seeing his rival forced to publicly acknowledge his contributions to the movement. The citation stated that only future generations will be able to assess accurately just how deeply this man influenced the spiritual shape and worldview of the National Socialist state. Those words would prove to be more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. Because as Germany prepared for war in the late 1930s, Alfred's role was about to expand dramatically. His theories about racial superiority and the need for German living space in Eastern Europe had helped provide the intellectual justification for what was coming next, a war of conquest and extermination unlike anything the world had ever seen. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering World War II, Alfred initially continued his cultural and propaganda work. But everything changed in June 1941 when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Alfred found himself returning to his homeland for the first time in over 20 years, not as a refugee but as a conqueror. Hitler appointed Alfred as Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern territories, putting him in charge of governing much of Eastern Europe. The man who had fled Estonia as a penniless refugee was now returning as one of the most powerful officials in Nazi Germany. The irony was staggering. Alfred was coming home to implement the very racial theories that his difficult childhood had helped create. Alfred's vision for Eastern Europe was both grandiose and terrifying. He proposed dividing the entire region into 4 massive administrative zones called Reichskommissariats. One of these, called Ostland or Eastland, would include his native Estonia along with Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Belarus. The name itself was significant. Ostland had been a medieval term for the Baltic region when German crusading knights had conquered and colonized it centuries earlier. Alfred was literally trying to recreate the medieval German Empire in Eastern Europe. His plans called for turning the Slavic populations into a permanent underclass, working as serfs for German colonists who would settle on their lands. While some other Nazi leaders proposed the mass murder of tens of millions of Eastern Europeans to make room for German settlers, Alfred's approach was slightly less genocidal. He only wanted to enslave them. How generous. But implementing these theories proved much more difficult than writing about them. Alfred immediately found himself in conflict with other Nazi leaders who had their own plans for Eastern Europe. Hermann Göring controlled economic policy, Heinrich Himmler ran security operations, and Hans Frank governed occupied Poland. Hitler deliberately created these overlapping jurisdictions to keep his subordinates fighting each other instead of challenging his authority. Alfred became obsessed with dismantling the Soviet collective farm system and redistributing land to private owners. While this might sound reasonable, it was actually a massive distraction during wartime. His rivals exploited these administrative problems to undermine his influence with Hitler. Meanwhile, the war itself was turning against Germany. But Alfred's most horrific contribution to Nazi rule was his direct involvement in the Holocaust. As early as winter 1941, he was boasting that Estonia had been declared empty of Jewish people after SS death squads had murdered virtually the entire Jewish population. In November 1941, just as plans for the systematic extermination of European Jewry were being finalized, Alfred gave one of the most chilling speeches in human history. Speaking to a gathering of Nazi officials, Alfred declared, "Some 6 million Jews still live in the East, and this question can only be solved by a biological extermination of the whole of Jewry in Europe. The Jewish question will only be solved for Germany when the last Jew has left German territory, and it will only be solved for Europe when not a single Jew stands on the European continent as far as the Urals." Let that sink in for a moment. This man, who had started life as an orphaned refugee, was now calmly discussing the systematic murder of an entire people. The broken child had become one of history's greatest monsters. While Alfred wasn't personally present at the infamous Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the final solution was organized, his top deputies were there and reported everything back to him. He had particular jurisdiction over the Holocaust in Latvia, where an estimated 70,000 of the 93,000 Jewish residents were murdered. In summer 1942, Alfred personally visited a Jewish ghetto in Ukraine that was liquidated just weeks later, sending thousands to their deaths. Throughout this period, Alfred was also overseeing one of history's largest cultural theft operations. His Reichsleiter Rosenberg task force systematically looted museums, galleries, libraries, and private collections across occupied Europe. Nearly 500,000 tons of cultural artifacts were stolen and shipped to Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria. Paintings, manuscripts, sculptures, books, anything of cultural value was fair game. Many of these treasures are still missing today, nearly 80 years later. But Alfred's moment in the sun was brief. By 1942, the tide of war was turning against Germany. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union in 1941, followed by America's entry into the war, meant that Germany was now fighting a multi-front conflict it couldn't win. As military defeats mounted, Hitler began lashing out at anyone he could blame for the disasters. Alfred, like many other Nazi leaders, found himself increasingly cut off from the Führer's inner circle. The final years of the war were a slow-motion catastrophe for Alfred personally and for Nazi Germany as a whole. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in crushing defeat for German forces in early 1943, and from that point on, Soviet armies were steadily pushing westward. By autumn 1944, Alfred's beloved Baltic homeland had been liberated. Tallinn fell to Soviet forces in September, followed by Riga in October. Alfred, watching from Berlin as his empire crumbled, wrote in his diary, "In the East, incessant retreat." The man who had dreamed of German dominion over Eastern Europe was watching his fantasies collapse in real time. He met with Hitler for the final time in February 1945, shocked by the dictator's physical and mental deterioration. Even Alfred could see that the end was near. As Soviet forces approached Berlin in April 1945, Alfred made preparations for the end. He stockpiled cyanide pills, determined not to be taken alive by the Russians, who had every reason to want revenge for what he had done to their people. Along with his second wife, Hedwig, and their daughter, Irene, Alfred fled Berlin for the German-Danish border, arriving in the town of Flensburg just days before Hitler's suicide. On May 19, 1945, Alfred Rosenberg was taken into British custody. As his plane flew over the bombed-out ruins of Cologne, he looked down at the devastation and wrote that the city looked like it had been trampled down by gigantic beasts. The rubble was heaped around the skeleton of the cathedral like a desert, giving evidence of the terrible fate of people and Reich. The man who had helped bring this destruction to the world was, finally, beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. Alfred was selected as one of the main defendants for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the trial that would determine the fate of Nazi Germany's leadership. Alongside him in the dock were Goering, Himmler's deputies, the foreign ministers who had helped plan the war, and the generals who had carried out mass murder on the Eastern Front. For nearly a year, the world watched as the crimes of the Nazi regime were laid bare in excruciating detail. Throughout the trial, Alfred maintained his innocence, claiming he had been unaware of the mass murder of Jewish people. This was completely implausible given his roles in the government, and the fact that his own subordinates had been present at the Wannsee conference where the final solution was planned. But Alfred stuck to his story, perhaps hoping that his reputation as an intellectual rather than a hands-on administrator might save his life. It didn't work. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts were announced. Alfred Rosenberg was one of only 6 defendants found guilty on all 4 charges: crimes against peace, planning aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, Alfred Rosenberg was led to the gallows. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said no. Of all the Nazi leaders executed that night, he was the only one who remained silent to the end. His body was cremated, and the ashes scattered in southern Germany to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for future Nazi sympathizers. So why should we care about Alfred Rosenberg today? Why does this forgotten Nazi matter when we already know about Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels? Because Alfred represents something uniquely dangerous, the intellectual who provides scholarly respectability to hatred and violence. He took the raw anti-Semitism and nationalism of his era and dressed it up in academic language, making it seem rational and scientific. Alfred shows us how broken, traumatized individuals can become instruments of mass destruction when they find ideologies that give meaning to their pain by channeling it into hatred of others. His life demonstrates how personal suffering, instead of creating empathy and compassion, can sometimes produce its exact opposite, a desire to inflict that same suffering on others. But perhaps most importantly, Alfred Rosenberg reminds us that ideas have consequences. The books he wrote, the theories he promoted, the cultural movements he led, these weren't just academic exercises. They were the intellectual foundation for genocide. His words became the justification for the murder of millions of innocent people. The prosecutors at Nuremberg understood this. They repeatedly emphasized that through works like The Myth of the 20th Century, Alfred had been one of the ideological architects of the Third Reich. He hadn't just followed orders. He had helped create the worldview that made those orders seem necessary and justified. Today, as we see new forms of extremism spreading through social media and online communities, Alfred Rosenberg's story serves as a warning. Dangerous ideas don't always come from obvious villains. Sometimes they come from people who present themselves as intellectuals and scholars. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one with a PhD and a bookshelf full of academic credentials. Alfred Rosenberg died believing he was a misunderstood genius whose racial theories would eventually be vindicated by history. Instead, he's remembered as one of the principal architects of humanity's darkest chapter. His life reminds us that intelligence without wisdom, scholarship without conscience, and ideas without humanity can become the most dangerous forces on Earth. The next time you encounter someone promoting theories about racial superiority, genetic destiny, or the supposed inferiority of other groups, remember Alfred Rosenberg. Remember how a broken, bitter man from Estonia helped convince an entire nation to embrace genocide. Remember that ideas matter. Words have power, and the person writing the academic paper might be more dangerous than the person holding the gun. What do you think? Was Alfred Rosenberg truly one of the most influential Nazi leaders, or has history overlooked him for good reason? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this deep dive into one of history's most dangerous minds opened your eyes to something new, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten stories that shaped our world. Because the only way to prevent history from repeating itself is to understand how it happened in the first place. What if I told you that the man who orchestrated one of history's most infamous surprise attacks actually never wanted the war to happen in the first place? Picture this. A Japanese admiral who loved American culture, had friends in the U.S. Navy, and repeatedly warned his own government that fighting America would be suicide. Yet this same man would go on to plan Pearl Harbor. Sounds impossible, right? Well, buckle up, because the story of Admiral Yamamoto is about to blow your mind. December 7th, 1941. It's a peaceful Sunday morning in Hawaii when suddenly the sky erupts with the sound of warplanes. Japanese bombers are descending like a deadly storm on Pearl Harbor, catching the American fleet completely off guard. Ships are sinking, explosions are echoing across the water, and in just a few hours, America is thrust into World War II. But here's the crazy part. 4,000 miles away, sitting on his flagship in a Japanese bay, the architect of this devastating attack is waiting nervously for news, knowing full well that this moment could either make or destroy his entire nation. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and trust me, his story is nothing like what you'd expect from a wartime enemy. Let's rewind to 1884. Our future admiral wasn't even born a Yamamoto. He started life as Isoroku Takano in a small Japanese town called Nagaoka. Now get this, his name literally means 56 because that's how old his father was when he was born. Talk about a unique naming system. But here's where it gets interesting. His father came from a samurai family, and back then being a samurai in Japan wasn't exactly a ticket to success anymore. You see, Japan was going through massive changes. For centuries, the country had been completely isolated from the outside world. No foreign trade, no outside influence, nothing. Then suddenly, American warships showed up in the 1850s and basically forced Japan to open up. Imagine living in complete isolation for hundreds of years, and then boom. The entire world comes knocking at your door. This created a huge split in Japanese society. Some people wanted to embrace Western technology and modernize everything, while others wanted to keep the old ways alive. Young Isoroku grew up right in the middle of this cultural earthquake, and it shaped everything about his future. Now here's something that'll surprise you. This future architect of Pearl Harbor was actually taught English by a Christian missionary. He read the Bible and was exposed to Western ideas from a very young age. Most Japanese kids at the time were suspicious of anything foreign, but not Isoroku. He was curious, open-minded, and fascinated by the outside world. When he was just 17, something incredible happened. He scored second place in the entire country on the entrance exams for Japan's Naval Academy. Think about that pressure. Thousands of kids competing for just a handful of spots, and this small-town boy from a struggling samurai family nearly topped them all. At the academy, while other cadets were wary of him reading his Bible, Isoroku was already showing signs of the strategic mind that would later shock the world. He specialized in naval gunnery and was well respected, but more importantly, he was learning to think differently from everyone around him. And then came his first taste of real combat. In 1905, Japan went to war with Russia, and 21-year-old Isoroku found himself in the middle of one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The Battle of Tsushima was basically Japan's coming out party as a world power. They absolutely demolished the Russian fleet, but for young Isoroku, victory came at a personal cost. During the battle, an explosion tore off 2 of his fingers and left him with a permanent leg wound. But here's what's remarkable. Instead of being discouraged, this injury only motivated him more. He received a personal letter of commendation from Admiral Togo himself, the hero of the battle. This moment planted a seed in Yamamoto's mind about the power of surprise attacks, something that would become his signature strategy decades later. Fast forward to the 1910s and our wounded veteran is climbing the naval ranks. But what's really fascinating is what happened when he got sent to America for the first time. Remember, this is supposed to be Japan's future enemy, right? Well, Yamamoto fell in love with the place. He studied at Harvard, traveled to Chicago and Detroit, and was absolutely amazed by American industrial power. He wasn't just visiting as a tourist either. He was there on official business, studying petroleum resources because Japan was running dangerously low on oil. But in his spare time, he was playing poker and bridge with American naval officers, learning English and developing genuine friendships with the people he was supposed to be gathering intelligence on. This is where the story gets really complex. Yamamoto could see America's incredible potential. Their factories, their resources, their innovative spirit. It both impressed and terrified him. He realized that if Japan ever went to war with America, it would be like a lightweight boxer challenging a heavyweight champion. But while Yamamoto was becoming more internationally minded, Japan itself was heading in the opposite direction. The country was getting more aggressive, more nationalistic, and more convinced that it could take on the world. During the 1930s, Japan invaded Manchuria, withdrew from the League of Nations, and started making enemies left and right. And Yamamoto? He was one of the few high-ranking officials speaking out against it. He repeatedly warned his colleagues that war with America would be catastrophic. He knew the numbers, he'd seen their industrial capacity firsthand, and he understood what most Japanese leaders refused to accept, that Japan simply couldn't win a long war against the United States. But here's where duty and personal beliefs collided in the most dramatic way possible. Despite his opposition to war, despite his friendships with Americans, despite his certainty that Japan would lose, Yamamoto was a naval officer. When his country decided on war, his job was to figure out how to win it. And that's when his brilliant but conflicted mind came up with the Pearl Harbor plan. Yamamoto's logic was actually pretty sound, even if it was based on a terrible premise. He figured that if Japan absolutely had to fight America, the only chance was to strike so hard and so fast that the Americans would be willing to negotiate peace before their industrial machine could gear up for total war. He studied how Admiral Togo had surprised the Russians at Port Arthur in 1904, and he thought, what if we could do that again, but bigger? The American Pacific Fleet had recently moved from California to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, putting their ships much closer to Japan. To Yamamoto, this looked like an opportunity. So he spent months planning the most audacious naval operation in history. 6 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, a fleet approaching from the north in complete radio silence. It was brilliant, terrifying, and completely unprecedented. But even as he planned this attack, Yamamoto was telling anyone who would listen that Japan needed to end the war quickly. He famously said that his fleet could run wild in the Pacific for maybe 6 months to a year. But after that, American production would overwhelm them completely. Think about that. The man planning Pearl Harbor was simultaneously predicting Japan's eventual defeat. It's like a chess master making a brilliant opening move while knowing he's going to lose the game. December 7th, 1941 arrives and everything goes almost exactly according to plan. The attack is a tactical masterpiece, American battleships are sunk or damaged, hundreds of planes are destroyed, and the Pacific Fleet is crippled. Japan achieves complete surprise and inflicts devastating damage. But Yamamoto wasn't celebrating. He was furious, actually, because Admiral Nagumo, who led the actual attack, pulled back too early. The shore facilities were still intact, the oil storage tanks weren't destroyed, and most critically, America's aircraft carriers weren't in port that day. They escaped completely. Yamamoto knew immediately that this was a problem. He'd wounded the giant, but he hadn't killed it. And now that giant was going to be very, very angry. His prediction proved correct faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months, Japan lost 4 of its most valuable aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway. It was a disaster that Yamamoto saw coming but couldn't prevent. The tide of war had already turned, and it was all downhill from there. For the next year and a half, Yamamoto fought a losing battle. He won some tactical victories, but strategically, Japan was doomed. American industrial production was ramping up exactly as he had predicted. New ships, new planes, new weapons were pouring out of American factories faster than Japan could ever hope to match. The man who had spent the 1930s warning against war with America was now watching his worst fears come true in real time. Every battle, every loss, every strategic defeat was proof that he had been right all along. And then, on April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's war came to an end. American intelligence intercepted his travel plans and sent fighter planes to shoot down his aircraft. The mastermind of Pearl Harbor died in the jungles of the Solomon Islands, never living to see the complete destruction of Japan that he had always predicted would result from fighting America. So here's the question that makes Yamamoto's story so fascinating. Was he a brilliant military strategist or a tragic figure caught in an impossible situation? He planned one of the most successful surprise attacks in military history. But he did it while believing his country was doomed to lose. He served his emperor faithfully while privately opposing everything his government was doing. In many ways, Yamamoto represents the complexity of war itself. He wasn't some cartoon villain plotting world domination. He was a thoughtful, internationally minded officer who understood his enemy better than most of his colleagues understood their own chances of victory. He tried to prevent a war he knew Japan couldn't win, and when prevention failed, he tried to win it anyway. The really tragic part? If Japanese leaders had listened to Yamamoto's warnings in the 1930s instead of just his battle plans in 1941, millions of lives might have been saved, and history might have taken a completely different path. What do you think? Was Yamamoto a military genius trapped by duty, or could he have done more to prevent the disaster he saw coming? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story surprised you as much as it surprised me when I first learned about it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories from history that'll change how you see the world. What if I told you that one man's attempt to save a superpower actually ended up destroying it? That in trying to fix the Soviet Union, he accidentally tore it apart? Today we're diving into the incredible story of Mikhail Gorbachev, a leader who wanted to reform his nation but instead watched it crumble before his eyes. Picture this. It's Christmas Day, 1991. The most powerful communist leader on earth is about to resign, and with his resignation, an empire that lasted nearly 70 years will simply vanish. No massive war, no violent revolution, just one man stepping down and taking an entire superpower with him. But how did we get here? How did a farm boy from rural Russia end up holding the fate of half the world in his hands, only to watch it slip through his fingers? Let's rewind to March 2nd, 1931. In a tiny village called Privolnoye, tucked away in southwestern Russia, a baby is born who will change the course of history. This wasn't some grand palace or political dynasty, just a simple farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business. The boy's name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and from day one he was marked as different. Literally. He had this distinctive birthmark on his forehead, a red patch that would grow larger as he aged and become one of his most recognizable features. Little did anyone know that this mark would one day be recognized by world leaders and ordinary people alike. Mikhail's parents were as different as night and day, yet perfectly matched. His father Sergei was ethnically Russian, while his mother Maria came from a Ukrainian family that had moved to the area years earlier. They married young, really young by today's standards, when they were barely out of their teens in 1928. Now here's the thing about timing. Mikhail was born right in the middle of one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history. Just 14 years before his birth, the entire world had been turned upside down by revolution. The old Russian Empire had collapsed, the Bolsheviks had seized power, and a brutal civil war had torn the country apart. By the time little Mikhail was taking his first steps, Joseph Stalin had consolidated power and was implementing his radical transformation of Soviet society. And when I say radical, I mean it changed everything. From how people farmed, to how they thought about their own lives. Stalin's grand plan involved something called collectivization. Basically, instead of families owning their own small farms, everything would be pooled together into massive collective farms. Sounds reasonable in theory, right? In practice, it was an absolute disaster. The Gorbachev family found themselves right in the epicenter of this chaos. The government was essentially forcing farmers to give up everything they'd worked for generations to build. And if you resisted, well, let's just say resistance wasn't really an option. The result was catastrophic. A man-made famine swept through the region, killing millions of people. Mikhail was too young to understand what was happening, but his family was living through hell. Several of his uncles and aunts died from starvation during this period. Can you imagine? A family watching their loved ones literally waste away because of government policies. But here's what's fascinating about the Gorbachev family. Despite witnessing this tragedy firsthand, they remained committed communists. Mikhail's grandfather actually helped organize one of the first collective farms in their area. It's like they believed in the system even as it was destroying their lives. This loyalty to the communist cause would come back to haunt them later. During Stalin's Great Purge in the late 1930s, when the dictator decided to eliminate anyone he considered a threat, both of Mikhail's grandfathers were arrested and imprisoned. The very system they had supported had turned against them. Then came 1941 and everything changed again. Nazi Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, and suddenly the Gorbachev family found themselves in the middle of a war zone. The region where they lived became a key battleground as Hitler tried to capture the oil fields further south. Mikhail's father Sergei was drafted into the Red Army and sent off to fight. For months, the family had no idea if he was dead or alive. At one point, they even received word that he had been killed in action. Can you imagine young Mikhail's mother trying to hold the family together while thinking she'd lost her husband? But Sergei surprised everyone by showing up alive in 1943. He had survived some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war and made it home to his family. It was like a miracle. Meanwhile, young Mikhail was getting his first real taste of education. Here's one of the few genuinely positive things about the Soviet system. They made education available to everyone regardless of how poor their family was. Rich or poor, every child had the right to go to school. Of course, Mikhail's education was constantly interrupted by the chaos around them. The war meant that schools were often closed, teachers were sent to fight, and children were needed to help with farm work. It wasn't until 1944 that classes really resumed properly. When they did, something remarkable happened. Mikhail emerged as an exceptional student. He devoured books, not just the required communist texts, but Russian literature and even some Western authors when he could get his hands on them. He had this incredible curiosity about the world beyond his small village. But it wasn't just academics that interested him. Mikhail discovered he had a passion for theater and would often organize performances for the local community. He learned to play piano, became skilled at chess, and showed leadership qualities that impressed his teachers. This leadership potential led him to join something called Komsomol, basically the youth wing of the Communist Party. If you wanted any kind of future in the Soviet Union, joining Komsomol was essential. It was your ticket to higher education, better jobs, and political advancement. Mikhail didn't just join, he excelled. He quickly rose to lead the local branch and used his position to organize cultural events and theater groups. Even as a teenager, he was showing the kind of charismatic leadership that would later make him a world figure. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. When it came time to apply for university, Mikhail had the grades and the political credentials to apply to Moscow State University, the most prestigious institution in the entire Soviet Union. Getting accepted there was like winning the lottery. So in 1950, this farm boy from a tiny village packed his bags and headed to the big city. Moscow must have seemed like another planet to someone from rural southwestern Russia. The buildings, the crowds, the energy, everything was different. At university, Mikhail's political involvement deepened. He became a full member of the Communist Party and continued rising through the ranks of Komsomol. But something even more important happened during his time in Moscow. He met the love of his life. Her name was Raisa Titarenko, and she was studying philosophy. Like Mikhail, she came from a rural background. Her family was from Siberia. They were both small-town kids trying to make it in the big city, and they found each other. Their love story began in the early 1950s, and in 1953 they decided to get married. This wasn't just any year. 1953 was when Joseph Stalin died, ending nearly 3 decades of brutal dictatorship. The entire country was changing, and Mikhail and Raisa were starting their life together right in the middle of this transformation. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, began something called de-Stalinization. He openly criticized Stalin's crimes and started loosening the grip of terror that had characterized Soviet life for so long. For young people like Mikhail and Raisa, this felt like a breath of fresh air. They would go on to have one child together, a daughter named Irina, born in 1957. Raisa pursued a career in teaching while Mikhail completed his studies in law and political science. Both were committed to making their mark in the new, more open Soviet society. After graduation, Mikhail faced a choice that would define his entire career. He could have tried to stay in Moscow and compete for positions in the central government. Instead, he decided to return home to the Stavropol region where he'd grown up. This might seem like an odd choice, but it was actually brilliant strategy. In the Soviet system, the path to power often ran through regional leadership. You couldn't just jump to the top. You had to prove yourself by successfully managing local affairs first. So Mikhail came home and began the slow climb up the bureaucratic ladder. He started with youth organizations, then moved into agricultural management, then environmental policy. Each position taught him something new about how the Soviet system actually worked on the ground level. During the 1960s, he got opportunities to travel to other parts of Eastern Europe. These trips were eye-opening in ways the government probably didn't intend. Mikhail saw firsthand that people in countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland weren't nearly as happy with Soviet control as propaganda back home suggested. When Czechoslovakia tried to liberalize in 1968, an event known as the Prague Spring, Mikhail was sympathetic to the reformers. When Soviet tanks rolled in to crush the movement, he was deeply disturbed. This wasn't the kind of communism he believed in. Back home, his career continued to advance. In the 1970s, he became first secretary of the Stavropol region, essentially the governor of a large area with millions of people. This role gave him real executive experience and put him in charge of major infrastructure projects. The region was building something called the Great Stavropol Canal, a massive 480-kilometer waterway that was one of the engineering marvels of the Soviet Union. Managing a project of this scale required incredible organizational skills and political finesse. But more importantly, this position required Mikhail to travel regularly to Moscow for meetings with national leadership. He began building relationships with senior officials in the capital, and his competence and charisma made a strong impression. He also got opportunities to travel to Western Europe as part of official delegations. Just like his earlier trips to Eastern Europe, these journeys broadened his perspective in ways that would later prove crucial. He saw that Western countries weren't the hellholes that Soviet propaganda portrayed them as. In fact, many things seemed to work better there than back home. Now I want to be clear about something. Mikhail never became pro-Western or anti-communist, but he developed what we might call intellectual honesty, the ability to look at different systems objectively and see what worked and what didn't. This kind of thinking was exactly what the Soviet Union needed, though nobody realized it yet. By the late 1970s, the country was facing serious problems. The economy was stagnating, innovation was lacking, and the entire system seemed to be running on autopilot. Mikhail's big break came in 1978 when he was brought to Moscow as a secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. This meant leaving his regional power base, but it put him at the very center of national politics. His work in Moscow focused heavily on agriculture, managing the centralized planning of harvests and food distribution. It was technical, demanding work, but it showed his superiors that he could handle complex, large-scale operations. In 1980, at age 49, Mikhail was promoted to the Politburo, the most powerful governing body in the entire Soviet Union. He was the youngest member by far, joining a group of men mostly in their 60s and 70s who had risen to power during World War II. And here's where timing became everything. The Soviet leadership was literally dying off. Leonid Brezhnev, who had led the country since 1964, was seriously ill and died in 1982. His replacement, Yuri Andropov, was already nearly 70 and died in early 1984. The third leader, Konstantin Chernenko, was 72 when he took office and died after just 13 months. 3 leaders in less than 3 years. The Soviet Union was in desperate need of stability and new ideas. The old generation had to pass the torch to someone younger, and Mikhail Gorbachev was the obvious choice. In March 1985, at age 54, Mikhail became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, effectively the leader of the Soviet Union. He was taking charge of a superpower, but one that was facing enormous challenges. The Soviet economy was in serious trouble. Growth had completely stalled, productivity was declining, and the country was falling further behind the United States technologically. The military was struggling to keep up with American advances, and costly foreign adventures like the war in Afghanistan were draining resources. Mikhail knew that something had to change. He couldn't just continue with the same old policies and expect different results. The Soviet Union needed reform, and he was determined to provide it. His reform program centered on 2 key concepts that would become household words around the world: perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, was about economic reform. The idea was to introduce some market mechanisms into the Soviet economy while maintaining overall socialist control. Small-scale private business would be allowed. There would be more flexibility in how factories operated, and the rigid central planning system would be loosened somewhat. Glasnost, meaning openness or transparency, was about political and social reform. People would be allowed to discuss politics more freely. The media would be given more independence, and there would be greater transparency in government operations. These might sound like modest changes, but in the context of Soviet society, they were revolutionary. For nearly 70 years, the Communist Party had controlled every aspect of life. Any deviation from official policy could land you in prison or worse. Mikhail launched these reforms through the 12th five-year plan, which ran from 1985 to 1990. There were other initiatives too. Uskorenie, acceleration, pumped money into the economy to stimulate growth. New administrative structures were created to manage agricultural policy, and there was even a campaign to reduce alcoholism. The results were mixed at best. The economic reforms largely failed to revive growth and may have actually made some problems worse. But the political reforms succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and that would prove to be both Mikhail's greatest achievement and his ultimate downfall. As people gained more freedom to speak and organize, they began questioning not just specific policies but the entire system. And once that process started, it became impossible to control. At the same time, Mikhail was revolutionizing Soviet foreign policy. When he came to power in 1985, the Cold War was at one of its most dangerous points since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States and was taking an extremely aggressive approach toward the Soviet Union. Reagan had announced something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, basically a space-based missile defense system that critics mockingly called Star Wars. The program was probably technically impossible with 1980s technology, but it represented a new arms race that the Soviets simply couldn't afford to join. Tensions were so high that in 1983 the Soviets had actually come close to launching a nuclear strike because they thought NATO military exercises might be cover for a real attack. The world was sitting on a powder keg. Mikhail decided that this had to change. In November 1985, he met with Reagan for the first time at a summit in Geneva, Switzerland. Despite coming from completely different backgrounds, Reagan was a former Hollywood actor. The two men hit it off remarkably well. Both had grown up in rural working-class families, and both understood that their countries had far more to gain from cooperation than from continued confrontation. Their meetings often ran over schedule as they discussed everything from nuclear weapons to philosophy. A second summit in Reykjavik, Iceland, in October 1986 nearly produced a breakthrough agreement to eliminate nuclear weapons entirely. Though no deal was reached, both sides realized how eager the other was to step back from the nuclear brink. The third summit, in Washington, D.C. in December 1987, finally produced concrete results. Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, banning an entire class of nuclear weapons. It was the first time in history that the two superpowers had actually agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons they already possessed. This was just the beginning of what would become the most comprehensive nuclear disarmament agreements of the Cold War era. Between 1987 and 1991, the United States and Soviet Union signed treaty after treaty reducing their nuclear arsenals and conventional forces. But while Mikhail was making peace with America, he was facing growing crises at home and throughout the Soviet Empire. Some of these were inherited problems, others were new disasters that seemed to come out of nowhere. The worst inherited problem was Afghanistan. Soviet forces had invaded the country in December 1979 to prop up a communist government, but they'd gotten bogged down in an unwinnable war against Islamic guerrillas supplied by the United States. By the time Mikhail took power, the war had become the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a costly, bloody conflict that seemed to have no end. He tried changing tactics in 1986, but when that failed, he made the difficult decision to withdraw. The last Soviet troops left Afghanistan in February 1989, ending a 9-year occupation that had cost thousands of lives and enormous resources. The communist government they left behind collapsed within a few years, and the country descended into civil war. The new disaster was Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The initial response was a perfect example of everything wrong with the Soviet system. Officials tried to cover up the extent of the disaster, delayed evacuations to avoid panic, and provided misleading information to both their own people and the international community. Mikhail himself wasn't blameless in the initial response. He followed standard Soviet procedure of limiting information and trying to handle everything through official channels. But as the scale of the disaster became clear, he began to change his approach. Later, he would say that Chernobyl was possibly the single biggest factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The disaster exposed the incompetence and dishonesty that had become endemic in the system, and it fueled demands for the kind of openness that glasnost promised. Meanwhile, the greater freedoms that Mikhail was allowing within the Soviet Union were creating expectations for change throughout Eastern Europe. People in countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany began to think that maybe, just maybe, they could free themselves from Soviet control. The first major test came in Poland in 1988, when nationwide strikes led by future President Lech Walesa forced the communist government into negotiations. In the past, the Soviets would have sent tanks to crush such movements. But when Mikhail visited Poland that summer, he made it clear that Moscow would not intervene militarily. This was a game changer. Once word spread that the Soviet Union wouldn't use force to maintain control, the floodgates opened. Throughout 1989, communist governments across Eastern Europe began to crumble. The most dramatic moment came on November 9, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. For 28 years, this concrete barrier had divided Berlin, Germany, and symbolically the entire world between East and West. The fall of the wall happened almost by accident. A series of events involving refugees traveling from East Germany through Hungary and Austria had made the border meaningless. When East German officials announced that people could visit West Germany, thousands rushed to the wall and began tearing it down with hammers, pickaxes, and bare hands. Mikhail's response was crucial. He could have ordered military intervention to stop the destruction of the wall and maintain East Germany as a separate country. Instead, he let events unfold naturally. Within a year, Germany was reunited for the first time since the end of World War II. Incredibly, some Western leaders were more worried about German reunification than Mikhail was. Britain's Margaret Thatcher and France's François Mitterrand both feared that a united Germany would become too powerful and destabilize Europe. But Mikhail understood that the Cold War division of Europe was artificial and unsustainable. He allowed German reunification to proceed, even though it meant accepting NATO expansion right up to what had been the Soviet border. This raises an issue that remains controversial today. When Germany reunited, there were discussions about NATO not expanding further east. Some claim there was an explicit promise that this wouldn't happen. Others, including Mikhail himself in later years, gave conflicting accounts of what was actually agreed to. What's clear is that there was at least an understanding that German reunification represented the final eastward expansion of NATO. That understanding was later abandoned as NATO expanded to include Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and eventually the Baltic states. But that was still in the future. In 1989 and 1990, Mikhail was being hailed as a hero for allowing the peaceful transformation of Europe. In 1990, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in ending the Cold War. Ironically, the Nobel Prize was much more popular internationally than it was in Russia itself. Many Soviets saw the award as proof that Mikhail had become too accommodating to Western interests. The same policies that made him a hero abroad were making him increasingly unpopular at home, and the challenges at home were mounting rapidly. The greater freedom that glasnost had unleashed was being used not just to criticize specific policies, but to question the entire Soviet system. Nationalist movements were emerging in the various republics that made up the USSR. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were the first to declare independence in 1990. These weren't just satellite countries like Poland or East Germany. They were actual parts of the Soviet Union itself. Other republics began making similar moves. Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all were asserting greater autonomy or outright independence. The union that had held together for nearly 70 years was falling apart. Mikhail tried desperately to hold things together. He negotiated a new union treaty that would have given the republics more autonomy while maintaining some form of federal structure. But it was too little. Too late. On August 18, 1991, a group of hardliners within the Communist Party decided they had seen enough. They launched a coup attempt, detaining Mikhail at his vacation home in Crimea while declaring a state of emergency in Moscow. The coup leaders included senior figures from the KGB, the military, and the party apparatus. They claimed to be saving the Soviet Union from chaos and dissolution. But they had badly miscalculated the mood of the country. The key figure in opposing the coup was Boris Yeltsin, who had emerged as Mikhail's main rival for leadership of Russia. On August 19th, Yeltsin climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament building and called for resistance to the coup. It was a defining moment. Television cameras captured Yeltsin defiantly standing on the tank, rallying supporters and calling for the restoration of legitimate government. The image went around the world and became an iconic symbol of the end of the Soviet era. The coup collapsed within 3 days. The military refused to support it, ordinary citizens came out in opposition, and international pressure mounted. Mikhail was released and returned to Moscow, but he discovered that the world had changed forever. Yeltsin was now the man of the hour. He had stood up to the coup plotters while Mikhail was under house arrest. More importantly, Yeltsin was actively promoting the idea of Russian independence from the Soviet Union. The final act came on December 8, 1991. Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus in the Belovezha forest and signed an agreement declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus would be independent countries. The other republics quickly joined in agreeing to the dissolution. Mikhail's position became impossible. He was president of a country that no longer existed. On December 25, 1991, Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television and announced his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. With that announcement, one of the most powerful empires in human history simply vanished. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and the Russian flag took its place. After nearly 70 years, the communist experiment was over. What followed was chaos. The carefully managed transition that Mikhail had envisioned never happened. Instead, Russia plunged into a period of economic collapse, political instability, and social upheaval that lasted throughout the 1990s. State assets were sold off at fire sale prices to a small group of oligarchs who became incredibly wealthy, while ordinary Russians saw their living standards plummet. Hyperinflation wiped out people's savings, crime rates soared, and life expectancy actually decreased. Mikhail watched all of this from the sidelines. He had tried to save the Soviet Union through gradual reform and ended up destroying it entirely. He remained active through his foundation and as an international speaker, but his political career in Russia was over. His personal life also suffered tremendously. His beloved wife Raisa was diagnosed with leukemia in 1999 and died within months. They had been married for 46 years, and her loss devastated him. As for his assessment of his successors, Mikhail initially had some hope for Vladimir Putin when he came to power in 2000. Putin was young, intelligent, and seemed committed to modernizing Russia. But as Putin consolidated power and became increasingly authoritarian, Mikhail became a critic. When Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, however, Mikhail supported the move, arguing that the peninsula had always been fundamentally Russian. But when the conflict with Ukraine expanded into full-scale war in February 2022, Mikhail was reportedly deeply opposed, though he was too ill to make any public statements. Mikhail Gorbachev died on August 30, 2022 at the age of 91. His death received much more attention internationally than it did in Russia itself. Western leaders praised him as the man who ended the Cold War peacefully, while many Russians still viewed him as the person who destroyed their country. German Chancellor Angela Merkel perhaps captured his legacy best when she said that in 1989, many East Germans feared that tanks would roll again to crush their hopes for freedom. But this time, no tanks rolled and no shots were fired, largely because of decisions that Mikhail Gorbachev made. So what should we make of this extraordinary life? Mikhail Gorbachev rose from rural poverty to lead one of the world's superpowers. He tried to reform a system that had become rigid and dysfunctional. He ended the Cold War peacefully and allowed the peoples of Eastern Europe to choose their own destinies. But in trying to save the Soviet Union, he inadvertently destroyed it. His reforms unleashed forces that he couldn't control, leading to the collapse of not just the communist system, but the country itself. Was he naive to think he could reform the Soviet Union without triggering its collapse? Could a gradually reformed version of the system have survived and prospered? These are questions historians will continue to debate. What's certain is that Mikhail Gorbachev changed the world in ways that are still being felt today. He showed that even the most powerful systems can be transformed by individuals willing to take enormous risks for what they believe is right. Whether you see him as a hero who freed half of Europe or as the man who accidentally destroyed his own country, there's no denying that his life was one of the most consequential of the 20th century. What do you think? Could the Soviet Union have been successfully reformed? Or was its collapse inevitable once the process of change began? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating figures, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories about the people who shaped our world.